Welcome back to the Valley to Peak Nutrition Podcast. It's Lindsay and I this week with another listener FAQ. This one was great. It's about the readouts on your Garmin watch, how they affect your nutrition, etc. So we touch on several different things about heart rate zones and how that affects nutrition. We talk about the load that Garmin determines on the watch, whether or not you can trust the caloric readout on the Garmin watch, and a number of other things. So that's all in this episode. At the end, you will hear me talk about something that we are doing new in 2023. We have someone who's a great friend of mine who sort of does all the behind the scenes website stuff for Valley to Peak. He's been working on building a online course, which we are going to launch hopefully here within the next month. And there is a lot to that. If you're interested in that, there will be a sign up in the show notes. And finally, in a couple of weeks, we are going to have on Chantel from Uphill Athlete, and we are going to cover a lot of different things as it relates to training. And she's got a pretty robust resume in terms of studying high altitude, specifically how high altitudes affect us as people. And so we're going to talk through several things. I've had questions for her that people have asked me. And so I just would love to hear another perspective on the topic to give to you guys. So if you got any questions that you want her to answer, you can shoot those over to me. We'll try to weave those in as long as it doesn't create a long podcast, because I have a feeling it's already going to be a good one. But you can send those to info@v2pnutrition.com. And if you need anything, you can send it to that same email. So here is Lindsay and I this week about Garmin watches and the data on there and how much to trust them or not. Welcome back to the Valley to Peak Nutrition Podcast. Lindsay's with me again this week, but there's been some fun stuff come up since we did this last. Huh? Well, we had the banquet last night. That was something new and good turnout in Boise. They gave away a K4, and Mark, who's on the podcast a lot, is connected close to Exo Mountain Gear, and we're friends with those guys. They released a new pack called the K4, and it's a lot of hype around that, and for good reason. So if you haven't checked that out, you can go check that out, or I'll put a link in there to do it. But it's Saturday and raining still, and lots and lots and lots of snow in the mountains. So we're wondering if we'll ever actually even be able to get to enjoy spring, but hopefully it's around the corner. We will go ahead and dive into the question.
How reliable is my fitness tracker when estimating the number of calories burned in my exercise?
It's a really good question, and a question that I will often get asked. It'll be asked in the form of a question to me, like by a client in Valley to Peak, or they will mention it in their conversation. Like, for example, they'll say, okay, well, I'm eating this much, and according to Garmin, I'm burning this much on my activity. So should I increase or should I decrease my intake based off of that? And so if the question's saying, how accurate is it? It's not. And the reason why that is because Garmin takes basically an algorithm. It also uses your heart rate, but there are some pretty standard factors that really don't involve you. And there's a number of different variables that you could go down, a number of different rabbit trails that you could go down to explain why it's inaccurate. But I think one of the best examples would be when you're looking at the number of calories burned in an exercise. It's going to be different based on every person. So for example, me at 5'6", 150 pounds, year one of training will consume a lot more fuel and exercise compared to 5'6", 150 pounds 14 years later, right? Because my body is just more accustomed to exercising, so it doesn't burn as many as it did whenever it first started. And likewise, when you first begin an exercise, even if it's the exact same, like if you start in the exact same year, you work out, if you, like, let's say you get on a treadmill for 45 minutes and you burn 500 calories the first time you do it. If you keep getting on that, and you keep getting on that, and you keep getting on that, 3 months later, even if you're doing the same exercise, the number of calories burned at that time interval could be 50% of what it was when you first started, because from an economy standpoint, you've gotten better. Now, the good news is that's the value of training, is you're getting better. So the body's becoming more and more adaptive to it. So if you're using activity as a way to help create a calorie deficit and help you lose fat. And all of a sudden you've plateaued, and people will say, like, I'm doing the exact same thing. I don't understand what happened. That's the problem. You're doing the exact same thing, and the body is basically yawning and saying, we're very used to this. This is nothing to us anymore. And so, like, you might notice that when you first start working out, doing something, you're just sweating a ton. You leave the gym, or you leave the trail, or you leave whatever, just with sweat rolling off of you. You do that exact same workout, call it 2 to 3 times per week. By month 3, it's you get back to the back to the truck or back to the car or whatever, and it's like you've not even done anything. And that's because of a fuel economy standpoint. So if you go back to the question itself and say, is it accurate? It's inaccurate because it's not taking into account a number of different variables that really hone in on exactly what your specific needs are.
So what are some, you talked about plateauing and the same effect lasting for a bit before you might have to, mix things up a little bit to continue to see, goals you have reached. Part of the question is, what are some alternative ways to adjust my intake if my exercise increases? Or you could say if I maybe hit that plateau.
So the gold standard is to hook someone up to a machine that has a mask and measures how much carbon dioxide you breathe off, how much oxygen you take in, and compares it against an algorithm, and it gives you an actual metric on what you're using. Assuming either A, no one's got access to that, B, no one wants to spend the money on that, C, no one wants to deal with all of that. Everything else is still guessing, but it's really good guesses. And I only say it's good guesses because this is what I've used for years and years and years, and it's been accurate. So number one, if the exercise is pretty vigorous, you're noticing that it's really increasing your heart rate a lot, you're having to work fairly hard, I think it's safe to add in roughly 100 calories for every 10 minutes. You run for 20 minutes, 200 calories, 30 minutes, 300 calories, and so on and so forth. That's a rough estimate, and I'm sure people are screaming like, well, is that going to be true for the 150-pound guy and the 300-pound guy? Because the heavier guy is obviously going to burn more fuel because he's carrying more weight, just like if the 150-pound guy strapped on a 150-pound backpack, it would be similar. Yes, I use it as a general rule of thumb because you got to remember the 300-pound guy, the body is used to weighing 300 pounds. It's adapted to weighing that much. So 10 minutes of exercise, he may be running a 14-minute mile while the 150-pound guy is running a 7-minute mile, also used to that same weight. So it's a general rule of thumb, but it's what I've used. If it's moderate, you could do somewhere between 5 and 7. If it's a light, 5 or less calories per minute active. The other thing, and this is a little more, let's call it scientific, track what you're eating, be very intentional about it, and then monitor your weight, right? So let's say that you increase your activity and you find that over a 7-day period, you're at 2,500 calories and your weight's dropping. I would add on 10%, add on 250 calories. That takes you up to 2,750, 7 days, rinse and repeat. I would keep it linear. People will want to cycle it. They'll eat less on recovery days and they'll eat high on a long run day, but you have to remember that the body is recovering from the long run, so you still need higher calorie intake on the day after. You don't want to cycle it. So you have people will do that and they'll say like, well, I don't understand why I'm still losing so much weight because the training volume goes up so much. It's like, well, because you're not covering the recovery on your low days. So I think it's easier just to find a number and to keep it linear, aim for that number every day, even rest days.
I think and this might help clarify that, I think what most people imagine is that calories in, calories out, it's like, I don't know, I want to say like one-on-one. I don't know if that's the right term, but I think to realize that the calories aren't just fueling what you're doing right now. There's things going on within the body, whether it be recovery or prep or whatever, that also require those calories. It's not I think 1-to-1 ratio. Those calories are being used in other ways, or being burned, I should say, in other ways too, right? Besides just exercise.
Yeah, I mean you have to remember it is covering exercise. It's also covering recovery. It's also covering your heart beating. It's also covering your lungs working. I mean it's covering everything. And so, what's so tricky about I don't know if it's I don't want to say my job or my role or whatever is, a lot of people are interested in fat loss and there's often this like underlying fear to eat anything because calories cause you to gain weight. And that's true. Too many do, but they also help you recover and to do the things you love to do and to be able to keep up with your kids. Like this week, I made an Instagram post and I went back and forth on whether or not to make it because it felt, well, I always struggle with like not wanting to be arrogant. I didn't think it sounded arrogant. And basically, it was just saying, one of the best things that ever happened to me in my weight loss was the ability to be able to do my workout in the morning, to work a full day and still have enough energy to play with my kids. I mean, that alone, yes, I have to pay attention to kind of what I eat and my habits, but I also have to remember to make sure I'm eating enough because I have a job after my job too, and I want to be sure that I cover that. And we're going to cover this topic here in a second, but there is a piece of the exercise calorie equation that is usually not accounted for, and that's the amount of calories needed once the exercise stops. So yes, exercise in and of itself is consuming calories, but the recovery afterwards is also a part of that equation, which is, one thing we'll look at in a minute. So kind of as a look back, like a general rule of thumb, if it's pretty hard activity, pretty challenging for you, pretty long, 10 calories per 10 minutes. I'm sorry, not 10 calories per 10 minutes, 10 calories per minute for vigorous exercise, 5 to 7 calories per minute for moderate exercise, 5 calories per minute for low exercise. So that would translate into, and where I kept getting hung up at was for every 10 minutes, that would be 100 calories if the exercise is fairly vigorous. So apologize if that confused anyone. And then play with it. See what happens to your weight, what happens to your performance, because there is always this fine line. Like, even if you're trying to lose fat, you do want to make sure that you're getting enough protein to recover the muscle and avoid injury. You do want to make sure that you're getting enough carbohydrate to get through an actual workout. The only thing that makes nutrition does not make you better at a certain activity. Training does. You have to have a good training plan. The nutrition just helps you recover and fuel for that training plan. And then the execution of that training plan is what actually makes you better. So there is a fine line that exists there, and you want to make sure that you don't veer too far on either side of it, or you will lose one of the goals you're trying to hit.
This is a bit of an extension to what was asked already, but how is Garmin's training load determined?
Yeah, so this your watch will give you a lot of readout, and I for the record, I think that some of that data is extremely helpful and valuable to watch, but I wouldn't take it all the way to gospel. Like I wouldn't what we call chase the number, right? I would also incorporate my brain. So Garmin has a feature where it will determine your training load, and basically what it's doing is it's measuring the sum of that equation we talked about after the exercise is over. And so this is called, we had a whole podcast on this, and it's called the post-workout oxygen consumption equation, basically. And it's looking at how many calories does your body need after the workout's over to recover. The more vigorous the exercise, the higher that EPOC is going to be. All right. And so Garmin determines the training load based off of that. More vigorous exercise, higher training load. Low vigorous exercise, lower training load. And then they give you these ranges to fall within, either low, ideal, or too high. And the premise is, okay, well, obviously you want to be somewhere in the ideal range. Anything too low probably means you're not going to reap any sort of a benefit. You're not going to perform better. So if you've peaked and you can't figure out why you can't get better, it could be that the training load is too high. If you've peaked in any of your endurance training or workout training or whatever, that you've been trying to keep too high of a load and poor recovery. And so you can never get beyond these peaks. You just sort of stay where you're at, which is incredibly discouraging.
This next part of the question takes into an account another feature of Garmin, and it's, do my calorie needs change at all for different heart rate zones?
That's an excellent question. So heart rate zones are all the rage right now. Everyone and their mom and dad seem to be targeting heart rate zones for training, with the idea of there being 5 different heart rate zones, and all of those are based on a percentage of your maximum heart rate. The idea is if you train within a certain zone, you'll reap the benefit of that zone. So if you train in a lower zone, you can stretch the endurance more. If you train in a higher zone, then you reap the benefits of fast work, right? Not necessarily endurance, but just quick sprint type work. From a fueling standpoint, and I'm going to throw this in here too, so in a couple of weeks, we're going to do a podcast with the director of coaching over at Uphill Athlete, who's sort of wrote the book on this and talk exactly about this more, because I think it'll be super helpful. So from a fuel economy standpoint, the idea is at these lower heart rate zones, your body's consuming less carbohydrate, going to rely more on fat, which means that you can stretch the endurance longer. There is some back and forth on how true that is. It is true that, the less hard you work, the less the body relies on carbohydrate. The harder the activity, the body relies almost entirely on carbohydrate. So if you're walking down the road, probably not relying a lot on carbohydrate as fuel. If you are sprinting up a steep hill, heavy reliance, probably 100% reliance on carbohydrate. However, that does not mean you should fuel on fat, because the muscle still contracts the fastest off of carbohydrate. So what I think in terms of the heart rate zones is this: if it's a lower heart rate zone, call it zone 1, 2, and 3, you probably have longer periods of time between how often you need to fuel versus higher heart rate zones. But it does not, I would say it does not change how you should fuel. So for example, heart rate 2 and 3, maybe you take in carbohydrate once every 2 hours, whereas in zones 3 and 4, you're taking in carbohydrate every 45 minutes, because that reservoir of carbohydrate in the muscle is draining so rapidly that you have to fill it up. If you're in a lower heart rate zone, there's always a dynamic, the body is always relying on a dynamic sources of fuel. Like, it's never just burning carb unless it's really vigorous activity. It's never just burning fat. There's always a little bit of contribution from all of the sources. So even if you are in a lower heart rate zone, you will eventually deplete those stores and hit a wall. So it still remains important that you do refuel, although the time between those fuelings is probably longer because you have better fuel economy. You're not burning through it as quick.
The time between them and the amount at each fueling up.
The amount at each interval would stay the same, but you would have longer stretches. So for example, lower heart rate zones, let's say that you still would probably do between 60 and 90 grams of carbohydrate, but you could do it every, call it 2 hours. The higher heart rate zones, 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate, but every 45 minutes to 1 hour, right? And so it's important to remember that, because, like, for example, even if you're training for an endurance event, there are very likely to be some tempo runs incorporated, which is periods of time within your run where you are trying to push harder than is comfortable, because that ultimately stretches and makes you faster and better in endurance. So on those runs, you would want to fuel more often. But if you are specifically targeting a heart rate zone that's lower, you have the ability to fuel less often. And even if you don't have a fancy watch with, a heart rate tracker, you don't wear a heart rate monitor or anything like that, you could think of it as even your breathing or even your ability to carry on conversation. So those lower heart rate zones, you should be able to carry on a conversation for the most part. Your breathing should not be really labored. It should be pretty smooth. You should almost feel like you could do this forever. That's the idea. You could do it forever, right? And so the higher heart rate zones, it's a little challenging to carry on a conversation. You can get 5, 6, 7 words out, then you got to breathe. 5, 6, 7 words out, then you got to breathe. Breathing is labored. You're probably feeling like, I'm not going to be able to do this forever. But at the same time, you're not redlining either. You're not feeling like, okay, this is probably going to go another 20 seconds and I'm going to need to stop. That's like max heart rate and inability to do it. Why are you laughing at me?
Because everything you're explaining is what they talk about when a woman is in labor and having a baby. It's just taking me back.
There you go. So ladies who are preparing to have a baby, wear a heart rate monitor, take your carbs in, and tell them the dietitian said, look, I should be getting some Sour Patch Kids in every 45 minutes. What's the technical term where like right before you're about to have labor? There's like staging, pre-staging. So what's the one right before the kid comes out? Let's just call it game time. So when you get to like, and it's go time, tell them you need to be either get you some dextrose to hook it to an IV, or you need to start popping gummy bears, one of the two, because you're burning through them pretty quick. Yeah. So from a high level overview, I think the Garmin watches can be tremendously helpful. And even if you like nerding out over spreadsheets, it is enjoyable to see. I think one of the best things to monitor, I should just say this, I ignore most of what Garmin tells me. It's nice to have the GPS feature. It's nice to track time. It's nice to track miles. And it's nice to track heart rate, even if it's not with a chest strap, because what you'll start to see over time is you will start to see your average heart rate decrease. And that's a very good sign that you are improving in your fitness. And then you've got to adjust your training plan, etc. But like if you think about endurance training, a lot of people want to track miles, but if you're doing trail running, you probably would be better off tracking minutes, because not every trail is going to be the same. Some trails are going to be more challenging. So if you're trying to cover 10 miles on a pretty simple trail and it takes you, call it an hour and a half, and then you're trying to cover 10 miles on a really difficult trail, that's going to take you, 5 hours or so. There's a tremendous increase there. And when you're talking about balancing training loads and recovery and progression, those are the type of things to pay attention to. And so if you're tracking all of that and you're, using your breaths, or you're using your heart rate or whatever, I think it can be helpful. It's referenced earlier that we're going to have Chantel on from Uphill Athlete. I did some consultations with her. And one of the things that, she had said to me, she was like, don't be married to the numbers, also go by kind of what you're feeling and how you're progressing, and, enjoy the process. So we'll have her on to talk a lot about that and some high altitude stuff with nutrition. She's got a background that's immersed in high altitude research. And so it'll be exciting to have her on. We're probably going to break it up into 2 parts because there's so much, but that will be coming. And then also coming, Stephen, who works for us, has been working super hard developing something new for this year. And so we are coming out with basically a membership part of the website for Valley to Peak that's going to house everything education. We're going to have a 16-week course that anyone who wants to go through can go through. There'll be like a workbook included, and toying with the idea of doing small group coaching within that as well. And so all of that will be coming out soon. If you're interested in hearing about that when it launches, I will put a link in the show notes. You can sign up there, and once it launches, I will send you an email to let you know that it's live. You will not get a ton of stuff from us other than that, but if you're interested in that, it'd be a great way to get some exposure to Valley to Peak and learn some really easy to understand but profound information on nutrition. And we will put that link in the show notes. So appreciate everybody joining us. If you've got any questions, you can send those over to info@v2pnutrition.com, and we will cover them on some other rainy Saturday afternoon. Thanks for joining.